Any history of slavery in America begins with Charleston. By the time Charleston was settled in 1670, Englishmen from the West Indies were well acquainted with slavery and the huge profits they could reap from the toil of others. Slavery became the essential ingredient in the success of cash crop plantations in South Carolina. The slave trade would not have likely been as successful were it not for the unholy alliance between the English and the African kingdoms, who traded cargoes of human flesh for brass pans and kettles, guns, gunpowder, cloth, and alcohol for up to 600 African slaves, who were stacked like cordwood on English ships. With no room to breathe, food so poor, unsanitary conditions, and up to 3 months at sea, 20% of the human cargo was expected to be lost prior to arriving to America's shores. Upon arrival to Charleston, slaves were herded to the mart, where they were auctioned off for 100 and 200 sterling, which in today's money would be between $11,000 and $23,000. Most of these slaves went to work in rice fields on plantations. Writers of the time described the working conditions. Negroes, ankle and even mid-leg deep in water which floats on an oozy mud, and exposed all the while to a burning sun which makes the very air they breathe hotter than the human blood. These poor wretches are then in a furnace of stinking, putrid effluvia. A more horrible employment can hardly be imagined. Survival was poor amongst the slaves. Many died of malaria, poor nutrition, being overworked to exhaustion, and suffering harsh and cruel punishment for even minor discretions at the hands of their masters and overseers. 1 out of 3 slave children died before the age of 16, over a third of which died before they were even 1 year old. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the United States, with 400,000 of them living in South Carolina. African Americans, enslaved and free, made up 57% of South Carolina's population. Charleston was the nation's capital of the slave trade, the place where many of those enslaved people first landed in the New World. In 1803, the year that the Grimke family moved in, the Georgian-style clapboard house stood tall and boxy, as it still stands today, on what is now called East Bay Street, but was then known as Front Street in Charleston, South Carolina. The house had a view. Its east windows looked out 4 blocks away on the Cooper River and Gadsden's Wharf, where ocean-crossing slave ships were docked. From the house, one could see captured Africans being unloaded, and beyond, boats and barges traveling the river, some carrying rice and cotton, some pushing north carrying supplies and newly enslaved Africans to low-country plantations. It was this home that Judge John Grimke and his wife Mary were raising 11 of their remaining 14 children. When John Faucherode Grimke and Mary Smith were married, they merged the riches of several wealthy French Huguenot families with that of the oldest and most politically powerful landgrave families in the state. John Grimke was a wealthy planter and held hundreds of slaves. He was also a lawyer and served as chief judge of the Supreme Court of South Carolina. His wife Mary was a socialite in Charleston society and was known to be particularly strict and exacted cruel punishment to her slaves. Sarah Grimke was the 6th child of John and Mary Grimke. Her early childhood experiences and education shaped her future as an abolitionist and a feminist. Sarah said that at age 5, after she witnessed a slave being whipped, she tried to board a steamer to go to a place where there was no slavery. Sarah's dream was to become a lawyer like her father. She constantly read the books in her father's library, and despite how much her father appreciated her intelligence, even telling her that had she been a man, she would have been the greatest lawyer in South Carolina. He would still not allow her to attend Yale Law School with her brother Thomas. It was not an acceptable woman's vocation at the time. Much to her parents' consternation, Sarah taught Bible classes to the slaves on Sundays and secretly taught her personal waiting maid, Hetty, how to read. I took an almost malicious satisfaction in teaching my little waiting maid at night when she was supposed to be occupied combing and brushing my locks. The light was put out, the keyhole screened, and flat on our stomachs before the fire with the spelling book under our eyes, we defied the laws of South Carolina. Sarah's sister Angelina was born in 1805, the 14th and last child of John and Mary Grimke. At 13 years old, Sarah begged her parents to allow her to be Angelina's godmother. They acquiesced, and Sarah became a role model to her sister, and Angelina often called her mother. In 1817, Sarah's father became seriously ill. The doctors recommended he travel to Philadelphia to see a specialist. At age 26, Sarah accompanied her father to Philadelphia as his nursemaid. The doctor could not help her father, so they went to Long Branch, New Jersey to stay at a boarding house by the sea. In just a few weeks, her father, Judge John Grimke, passed away. Released of her father's control, Sarah became more independent and self-assured. She traveled back to Philadelphia where she met Israel Morris, who introduced her to Quakerism. Sarah drank in the Quakers' philosophies of liberal views on slavery, gender equality, their religious sincerity and simplicity. She wanted to become a Quaker minister, but even here she was shut out by the male-dominated Quaker Council. She returned to Charleston in 1827 to save her sister Angelina from the limitations of the South. Both girls committed to the Quaker faith and left Charleston and their mother in hysterics. Sarah and Angelina loathed slavery and all its degradations. They hoped that their Quaker faith would be more accepting of their abolitionist beliefs, but initial attempts to protest slavery caused them difficulties in the Quaker community. The sisters persisted and believed that the fight for women's rights was as important as the fight to abolish slavery. In 1836, Sarah published an epistle to the clergy of the southern states. Then in 1837, her Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and Condition of Women was printed in the Liberator, the newspaper published by radical abolitionist and women's rights leader William Lloyd Garrison. The Grimke Sisters were among the first female public speakers in the United States. They first spoke to parlor meetings of women only, as was considered proper. The sisters gained so much attention because of their class and background in having slaves and coming from a wealthy planter family. As they attracted larger audiences, the Grimke sisters began to speak in front of a mixed audience. They challenged social conventions by speaking for the anti-slavery movement at a time when there was widespread disapproval, and their very act of public speaking was not believed suitable for women. Sarah and Angelina came to understand that women were oppressed, and without power, women could not address or right the wrongs of society. In 1838, Angelina married Theodore Weld, the nation's most prominent abolitionist speaker, organizer, and author of American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. 2 days after they were married, Angelina Grimke gave a powerful speech at Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, while a mob attacked the building with rocks and bricks. The next night, a hired band of ruffians, led by wealthy men with investments in the South, burned down the hall which had just been built to provide abolitionists with a place to meet. It was a symbol of the abolitionist movement and a target for those who opposed it. Neither Sarah nor Angelina initially sought to become feminists, but both their abolitionist sentiments and their feminism sprang from deeply held religious convictions. Sarah, who eventually emphasized feminism over abolitionism, and Angelina, who remained primarily interested in the abolitionist movement, were powerful writers. They neatly summarized the abolitionist arguments which eventually led to the Civil War and lectured in support of President Lincoln during the war. Sarah Grimke's writings gave suffrage workers such as Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott several arguments and ideas that they would need to help end slavery and begin the women's suffrage movement. Sarah's work addressed many issues that are familiar to the feminist movement of the late 20th century, 150 years later. The sisters retired from speaking but continued to attend anti-slavery meetings and write volumes of abolitionist tracts and fight for women's rights. Angelina and Theodore moved in with Sarah, who remained with them throughout her life. They bought a farm in New Jersey, and the sisters made livings as teachers. Theodore and Angelina had 3 children. Sarah died in 1873, Angelina in 1879. The sisters lived to see the abolition of slavery and the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca, New York in 1848, but they did not live to realize the impact they had on the eventuality of Amendment 19, the right of women to vote. The Grimke sisters are remembered as the first publicly known white American female advocates of the abolition of slavery and women's rights. On July 19, 1848, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, the first Women's Rights Convention convened with 200 women in attendance and read the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, detailing the injustices inflicted upon women. On the second day of the convention, the famous abolitionist and women's rights supporter Frederick Douglass and 40 other men were invited to attend, and on that day they adopted and signed the Declaration.
It's growing darkness, I can't see the light. Sinking down under this weight, gotta push the fight.